Maria Ermelinda Nieto Compean de Robledo was my Mexican immigrant great-grandmother. She went by just Maria, however her grandchildren and great-grandchildren referred to her as Nana. Nana died when I was just 3.5 years old, but so much about this strong, loving woman has shaped who I am. This is because Nana is who raised my father. She stressed to Dad from a very young age the importance of education. Education and learning proper English, although Nana spoke little English herself, were the way out of the poverty in which this immigrant and first-generation family lived. It was the way to a better life in America. My father would go on to be the first in his family to attend and graduate college. By the time I took an interest in genealogy 24 years ago, none of Nana's living family could remember where specifically in Mexico she came from, other than the state of San Luis Potosí, Mexico. In 2003, I decided that despite not being remotely fluent in Spanish, I would find those answers for them. It's only been in the last 10 years that I found those answers. We knew that Maria's family fled the violent Mexican Revolution, leaving everything behind. But we knew little else before I started researching Nana's story about 20 years ago. Nana's husband, Jose Robledo, her mother, and several of Nana's siblings immigrated to the U.S. somewhat close together, settling in Long Beach, Los Angeles County, California, by the time the extended family group was enumerated together on the 1920 U.S. federal census. Nana and Jose, their two young Mexican-born children, and first U.S.-born child, my grandfather Benjamin, lived next door to her extended family. They had 5 more children by 1930 and had moved to the city of Los Angeles. People of Mexican descent were being heavily targeted in Los Angeles and other cities at this time, being swept up in raids that resulted in the unconstitutional deportation, labeled repatriation by the government and its proponents, of up to what some scholars claim were 2 million people of Mexican descent, including U.S.-born citizens. Nana and Jose had to have lived in fear that this might strike their family any time. Husband Jose died 7 years later in 1937 from pneumonia. The family had not been able to afford a doctor. Nana, a homemaker, took a job working in a sewing factory to support her children, with the oldest sons also helping to support the family. By the 1940 U.S. Census, we find widowed Maria identified as the head of the home. This was around the time of the Zoot Suit riots, when people of Mexican descent, particularly young men like Nana's sons, were once again targeted with violence in Los Angeles. 3 of Nana's sons, including my grandfather, would go on to serve the U.S. in World War II or Korea. Becoming American was important to Maria. At 67 years old, Nana became a U.S. citizen. In 2003, I held her original signed petition for naturalization at the U.S. National Archives, then in Laguna Niguel, California. Nana, husband Jose, and young children Guadalupe and Refugio immigrated to the U.S. on October 17, 1915, by using the footbridge connecting Nuevo Laredo in the state of Tamaulipas, Mexico, to Laredo, Texas. Records tell us they crossed with an extended family network, that same family group who lived together in Long Beach in 1920, after taking the train. In October 2015, I took my father to Texas. We walked the current version of that same bridge from Texas to Nuevo Laredo, Mexico. We stood in Nuevo Laredo on the last piece of Mexican soil on which Dad's grandparents stood before saying goodbye to their home country. And then we walked into the U.S. exactly 100 years to the very date from when his grandparents crossed into the U.S. 2 years later, in November 2017, I took Dad to San Luis Potosí, Mexico, for the very first time. We visited the National Railway Museum there, where the very tracks still stand where his grandparents caught that train that took them to Laredo to walk into their new country. We also visited the small rural rancho in the hills, Rancho Temascal, where both grandparents lived. I have traced Dad's ancestors here in this rancho to the mid-1700s. We sat inside his family's hacienda, where Nana, the grandmother who raised Dad, was born in 1887 and lived until married in 1908. Dad and I were both overcome with emotion as we spoke with the hacienda caretaker, whose mother had worked for our family before they fled during the most violent period of the Revolution. Watching my father sit in his grandmother's childhood home, listening to stories about her family, has been one of the greatest highlights of my life. We also visited the church where that grandmother, Nana, was baptized in 1887 and where she married Jose in 1908. We walked in the footsteps of his ancestors throughout that rural region of central Mexico. Why does doing and teaching genealogy call me so strongly? First, it is so much fun to piece together the past through documented evidence, testing my search and analytical skills, and it brings joy to my family by sharing these discoveries. Second, studying microhistory makes history personal. And third, because genealogy has the power to teach us empathy. Learning about and retracing the lives of my immigrant great-grandparents helps me empathize more with immigrant and first-generation families and with their efforts or resistance towards assimilating and fitting into a new country.